Hey everyone, and welcome back. So today we're going to be reviewing Dadish 3 on the Nintendo Switch. Now this game is a 2D precision platformer. It was released on June 15th of 2022, and it currently sells on the Nintendo Switch eShop for $9.99. The game was both developed and published by Thomas K. Young, and it has a download size of only 134 megabytes. Now, the Dadish series is actually a series of platformers that I've been following since its beginning, and I've loved each individual entry, and also I've loved the evolution. And yet again in this entry, as you're going to see in just a couple of minutes, it's a huge evolution step yet again. So if you've played the other entries in this series, definitely watch this review before picking up Dadish 3, because there is a slight change of direction in the overall gameplay. And just before we jump into that, don't forget that one of the best ways to support the channel, if you're liking the content, just hit that like button. So if we start with the storyline, just as in every Dadish title, it starts out with Dadish unfortunately losing his 40-some odd kids. And this time around, it happens when the school bus gets into an accident during a field trip. Odd thing is, the radish kids never really have gone to school. And that right away brings us to one of the hallmarks of the series, which is the incredibly funny banter between Dadish and each one of his kids. They aren't drop down, rolling on the floor, laughing type of jokes, but they're an awesome kind of really warm humor. And each time I was reaching the end of a level, I just couldn't wait to see what they were gonna say. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. Dadish has to save all his kids by going through each and every level. The story itself doesn't make much sense and isn't super developed, but the interaction between the kids is really a highlight of the series. And on this point, this entry is no different than any one before it. I completely loved it. Now if we move on to the gameplay. Now the Dadish series has always played out as a precision platformer with very simple controls, only being able to move the player and with a jump and double jump command. And at least on the control end, this entry is no different. And once again, we're offered 50 levels of gameplay. New, however, to this entry in the series, the levels will be broken down into 3 major archetypes. The first one and most common are the standard platforming levels, where you'll just be controlling Dadish in a standard fashion. The second type of level you'll come across are the levels featuring Mamedo, who is Dadish's wife, and the mother of the kids. The difference here is you'll be riding on Mamedo's back, and she will be constantly jumping. You lose the ability to double jump, however her standard jump is much higher and much further. It really switches up the overall gameplay, forcing you to think about each and every jump before you make it. And lastly, you'll come across the dolphin levels, which are somewhat comparable to auto runner levels. Now in these levels, you'll have to keep up the dolphin to be able to ride on its back while making your way around different obstacles. Unfortunately, if you fall too far behind, you won't be able to make your way back to the dolphin, and it's an auto fail. Now the addition of 3 different archetypes of play here was super appreciated, and it's actually something I brought up in the previous titles that only had maybe 1 or 2 major archetypes. Now next, we're going to talk about what probably is the biggest change gameplay-wise for the Dadish series in this newest entry, and that is the difficulty level. Basically, Dadish 3 is by far the most difficult of all 3 entries. The 2 previous games would really ease your way into the different levels, and it's only, I would say, in the last dozen levels or so that the game would truly challenge anyone who is used to platforming games. Now in this game, it is totally different. By the 4th or 5th level, the difficulty level is equivalent to the end levels in the 2 previous entries. And I promise you that now the Dadish series has truly graduated to the full title of a precision platformer. It hasn't quite reached the level of something like Super Meat Boy, but nonetheless, some levels will require quite a few tries and might cause some level of frustration. However, just as in every great precision platformer, all the difficulty created throughout the levels is fair and comes down to execution. Now, on my end, I saw this as a positive point and a true evolution of the series, really adding something new and a more spicy entry for the 3rd one. However, at the same time, for anyone who was a fan of the laid-back nature of the previous 2 entries, with just a more difficult back end, might be somewhat put off by this entry. But if you are ready for the challenge, the satisfaction you get from completing the levels here is much more palpable and resulted in quite a few fist pumps in my case, and the whole banter that you get with one of their kids felt so much more like a reward because of it. On a final note, the extra difficulty level actually really helped the playtime as well. The previous 2 entries in this series I probably completed in about 2 hours of gameplay. This one here took me about 5 or 6. Now yes, most of that extra time was repeating the same levels over and over again till I managed to complete them, but at least at 5 or 6 hours of gameplay, the $10 price tag does feel better. And if I maybe had to point out one major flaw overall, it's that the boss fights in the game were actually too easy, and ended up being the easiest levels overall. The designs on the bosses themselves were interesting and fun, but the challenge level really wasn't equivalent to the rest of the game. Some people will see that as a bit of respite. On my end, I would have just preferred a challenge that is equivalent to the rest. So now if we move to the controls. Now this will be a very short section because they are very simple. You move Dadish using the left joystick or the D-pad, and you jump using the A button. Hitting the A button a second time will have you double jump. Now they did change the animation to Dadish's double jump where he does a little spin, but overall that has no impact on the controls. Now these controls are exactly what we had in the 2 previous entries. They worked fine for the other 2 games with all the other mechanics coming from the environment. Also, responsiveness here was top notch and I really didn't have any input delay issues. The controls also feel very tight and not floaty at all, exactly what I love to see from a precision platformer. Now if we move on to the graphics and sound. Now graphically, Dadish has a very simple pixel art presentation with an overall cartoony feel to it, with very chunky black lines around all the different characters. And you can also probably tell by what you've seen already, it goes for a very cutesy aesthetic. Now on my end, although simple, I really loved the overall simple visual presentation, especially due to its extremely smart use of vibrant colors. And if you've played the other 2 entries in the series, well, it's perfectly in line with the graphics you saw from those 2 previous entries. If I did have to point to maybe one thing that I would have liked to see evolve in the series, it would be the background designs. Now don't get me wrong, they're perfectly fine and in line with what we know from the Dadish series so far, but that feels like one area that we could add an extra level of detail all the while keeping the same overall feeling to the game. Now if we move on to the sound. Now the game's soundtrack is composed of 5 tracks, one associated to each major environment, therefore changing every 10 levels. Once again, this is pretty much in line with everything we've known from the series thus far. Where the overall impact does change here, however, is that in the previous games, since the playtimes were much shorter, the track loops never became redundant. However, in this game, since you'll be replaying a lot of the levels multiple times, unfortunately, the track loops became a little bit more apparent and a little bit more of variety would have been necessary. If the developer continues down the same path of going with more difficult gameplay, therefore extending the gameplay time, I really think a second track per area alternating between the levels should be added. The sound effects, on the other hand, were perfectly fitting and exactly in line with the rest of the series, and they didn't become annoying at all. Overall, it's a solid sound package, just not a stellar one. Now we get to the verdict. And if this is one of the first videos of mine you're watching, my full review scale is available down below in the description of the video. And in the case of Dadish 3 on the Nintendo Switch, I'm going to be giving the game an 8, putting it at the low end of a great game. Now for me, the move to a more difficult level design was one that I appreciated a lot. And to me, it really did make this game feel more like a direct sequel to the previous ones rather than just another Dadish game. But at the same time, I have to admit it's a bit of a risky move, because if a lot of the core audience was looking for a laid-back experience, they will maybe be more disappointed with Dadish 3. Also, in my opinion, the value proposition in this entry has really gone up, because the previous entries at $10 for maybe a couple of hours of gameplay didn't feel quite adequate. However, in this entry, at more like 5 or 6 hours for a $10 price point, with a lot of replayability to try to get all the stars, well, you know what? It really feels like a good offering. So if you find yourself now in that new audience of challenging precision platformers, Dadish 3 might be a really great pickup for you. So now I want to hear from all of you. Let me know what you thought of Dadish 3 and if you'll be picking it up in the comments down below. And don't forget, on the way out, if you did like the content, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and click on that notification bell so you know when all my future content comes out. And as usual, I hope I'll see you in my next video.